You've been home for a couple of years now, buddy, but you're still fighting the war.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shoulder, Untold Stories from a Forgotten War, a product of Grumpy Combat Veteran and Friends. Here at Shoulder to Shoulder, we share personal stories about all the ways in which war affects us. I, as you might know, am KK, one of the co-founders of GCVNF, and I am joined again and finally welcome back by my co-host, Will. How you doing?
I'm good, man. I had a good day today. I'm happy. And I'm happy to be here and to learn from our guest.
I am very excited that that's the tone that you take because Joanna is one of my favorite people. Our guest today is Joanna Naples-Mitchell. She's an international human rights lawyer in New York City. She is currently the director of the Redress Program at the Zomia Center, where she advocates on behalf of civilians who have been harmed in U.S. military operations in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan.
God bless you for doing that.
So I'm really excited about this conversation because, of course, we have GCV, who comes from the more conventional military side, and Joanna. And one of the reasons that we started GCV is because we wanted to offer a place where everybody could share their opinion as long as we dissent with respect. So with that in mind, welcome, Joanna.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited that you're here. And just for context, everyone, I met Joanna maybe like 15 years ago at the Department of Justice when we were not even lawyers yet. We were still just babies trying to figure out what we were going to do. So we have grown together in the legal field, and it has been so exciting to watch her develop. Joanna has always had a really big heart. And I think it's just like really encouraging to know that you're in this field because I think it's exactly where you're supposed to be. So let's start by talking about.
Man, someday she's gonna say something like nice to me like that.
Yeah, honey, you gotta earn that.
Man, that's fair. Man, I just go right ahead.
This is a fun group. I'm looking forward to this.
You should come to our happy hour.
That's right.
All right, next time.
All right, so let's give people just a foundation for the work because Zomia Center I've heard about, but I don't think it's one of the more broad national coalitions. So tell us a little bit about just what the center does.
Sure. I don't expect anyone listening to have heard of Zomia. If you have, I'm very impressed, and you've probably read my articles online. But so Zomia is an organization that was founded, a nonprofit founded in 2019. And was founded by several former war reporters and researchers who had spent a lot of time working in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, and perceived a need, basically in spaces they classified as non-state spaces where there's not a functioning central government. And Zomia is a word that various academic researchers have used to describe non-state spaces. So they thought it sounded cool. And also Zomia is a word that can be easily pronounced in both English and Arabic.
Although I just realized I was saying
How would you spell it in Arabic?
Oh, you can say it however. I've heard it every way. I'm actually not sure which way to say it, so I wouldn't hold back. Zomia, I've heard different colleagues pronounce it different ways.
We're doing our best.
We're doing our best.
Is it spelled with like an Arabic, like with?
We have. If you look at our website, our logo is kind of both English and Arabic of Zomia.
Okay, perfect.
Which is cool. But it's zomiacenter.org. But Zomia, so basically they founded this organization because they were forming all these networks in these countries and wanted to do more. And it first began with kind of public health work and advocacy and research. Okay. So it was essentially gap filling, like filling gaps between people there and international organizations or without a functioning government, helping to build local governance structures so that people could be self-sufficient. That was the idea. And that will actually... So go ahead.
It's so interesting that it came from like war reporters also, because who is better positioned to see what those gaps are than the people who are on the ground?
Exactly.
I really, really like that. And I'm curious too, if we know any of the war reporters.
Yes. So you've probably heard of some of them. Yeah, I was going to say, and Anand Gopal is the founder who probably has the most name recognition, but him, Nick McDonald. So yeah, exactly. Tom Peter, and then Anita Sridhar, who is a reporter and also is a physician, were the co-founders. Yeah,
that's a great team.
It's a very cool team. Yeah.
Okay, so when I first met you, I knew that you were oriented towards human rights, but what was it specifically about Zomia that you said, yes, this is the work that I really want to commit myself to?
Yeah. So I think it really was a sense of kind of filling gaps, and specifically, they recruited me to fill the gap between civilians who are harmed in U.S. military operations and the military itself. We specifically founded the program that I run, which we'll talk more about, because the Pentagon gets $3 million a year now from Congress to make small payments as an apology when civilians are injured or killed in their operations, and just has not been using that money in recent years, despite this authorization from Congress. And so we figured there must be a significant gap between people being harmed and the military for them to have this money but not really know how to spend it. And so we created this program to try to bridge that gap.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think it's that the military didn't know how to use it, or that they weren't inclined to use it because just the very nature of the work means that then they are acknowledging that there was some harm by their military operations?
Great question.
I think it's a mix, and I've gotten different answers from different people, and that's part of the kind of the mystery we're trying to solve with the program. I think that the big thing was the pivot from kind of ground operations to air wars in terms of how the U.S. operates specifically in the Middle East, and so it was just a lot less common to make these kinds of condolence payments once there was that switch, and no longer this motivation to win hearts and minds. There were some high-profile cases that got attention and therefore got offers for payments, but it was much less common. So. I do think that's a big part of it, is kind of finding the incentive for the U.S. military to make payments. I think there are a lot of incentives, and actually the military itself has changed course over the last couple of years in launching a new plan to mainstream civilian harm response across the Pentagon and across all the combatant commands, which we can get into.
Oh, inshallah. That's good to hear.
That's something that I want to hear more about, because I'm a little bit surprised. And no offense to the Pentagon, or a little bit, I guess, because my instinct would be,
they'll be fine.
My instinct is that they wouldn't want to acknowledge the scope of harm of what they do. But before we get specifically into what your work with the Pentagon is, tell me a little bit more about the redress program, how that came to be, and without going into your ethical conflicts as an attorney, just what the nature of the work is like broadly.
Sure. Yeah. So we founded the program 2 years ago, and essentially we are advocating on behalf of specific individual families who have been harmed, whether that's injuries, deaths, or a combination, in U.S. operations in Iraq and Syria or Afghanistan. We get connected with families, usually through a third party who has already vetted them to an extent. So we've gotten a lot of referrals from journalists. Most of our cases are from journalists.
Oh, okay.
We also get some referrals from NGOs or international organizations. And when we first launched the program, it was basically a test to see what is actually happening with $3 million. Why is it not being spent? What are the processes that exist or don't exist to even make requests for payments? And so we had to set expectations really, really low with the families we were working with to explain, there is this money, we don't know that we can access it. Payment amounts are likely going to be very small, just a few $1,000s. Is it worth it to you? And we focused on families where they had proactively approached reporters or NGOs asking for compensation for their losses and had shown that interest in the past. And so we kind of approached and said, hey, are you still interested? We are actually doing this work. And the idea was to try to improve processes for everyone. I represent about 30 families, but the idea is it goes so far beyond that, and trying to understand what the military processes are and then how we can improve them for other civilians too, and maybe even make them accessible enough. They don't need an advocate who is connected to some New York Times reporter to actually get something.
I mean, it's the hard nature of the work, though, right? Will was connected. I met Will doing the Afghanistan work after Kabul fell and helping to evacuate families. He obviously had access to people because he served in Afghanistan.
Sure.
I was more like you, which was getting referrals from people who were saying, oh, I know this family, but I don't quite know how to help them. So it was just a really different feel. So it does require that initial access to somebody who is going to pay attention to your story for it to even get off the ground. I'm curious if, as you started this just a couple of years ago, was there actually an official process in place for these families to be able to apply for this restitution? Or is this something that you've been having to develop with the Pentagon?
It's something I would say we've been having to develop with the Pentagon to a large extent, because I think, we did a pilot in 2021 where we kind of tested the process. Then that was before they launched this new civilian harm mitigation plan in 2022. So the process has evolved. I kind of just cold called Central Command and said, hi, can I speak to your legal department? And eventually got a hold of someone there and developed a relationship.
I bet that phone call took you forever to find the person. Was it like a series of calls and nobody answered and you're like, does anybody work here? And then finally somebody's like, hello. You're like, oh my God. Somebody's there. Sorry, I digress.
No, you would think. I mean, that's what navigating a bureaucracy is usually like. The funny thing is, in this case, I was trying Operation Inherent Resolve first. It's the U.S.-led coalition.
Yep.
operating in Iraq and Syria. I tried them first because they were my focal point in our pilot, and I had just been emailing public affairs basically then. They were not responding. So I just looked up CENTCOM online and I found the number for, I think it was their general number. They directed me to the legal department. And then a dad called me back, like a military lawyer called me back, and I got to know him and kind of showed him that I wasn't there to antagonize, like actually wanted to share information so they could do their jobs and maybe do their jobs better, kind of empowering them to do what they were hired to do. And we developed a really good relationship over the course of a year. And now, there's other folks there too, kind of, he's told them, actually, these NGOs are not all bad, right? A lot of them are actually really useful resources. Like, and it's not just, there's a lot of organizations doing this work.
NGOs?
There's a lot of groups doing this work out there. Some of our closest partners are Error Wars, which is doing open source documentation unbelievably across conflicts, including Iraq and Syria, but also Gaza, Ukraine. The Center for Civilians in Conflict was founded to do this exact work, advocating on behalf of civilians who are harmed. They do a really important policy advocacy. There's other groups doing individual representation, like Reprieve is representing a bunch of families in Yemen. Victim Advocates International does this in Somalia, et cetera. So all to say,
you did the Lord's work. Good for you.
Oh,
wow. Seriously, it's a thankless job, but I'm thanking you for it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It's definitely, I think the hardest thing is like advocacy is such a long game, and working with these families for years, building relationships and trying to kind of maintain their trust while I don't have results for most of them yet is really hard and keeps me motivated to keep going. But it is kind of the small victories on the way and the relationship building, which kind of feels like a victory in itself sometimes, that makes it easier.
People heal somehow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of, I recently read a book about like the founding of the NAACP. And the reason why is because I think it's so hard when you are an attorney working in advocacy, because you have to balance the needs of the people, which are often so great, with the fact that there is not a process in place for representing their needs. And so you have to sift through all of these like very painful and equally as valid stories to find the ones that are going to best help you create the system that's going to be in place in the future. And I think that that's something that people kind of undervalue, because especially if you are drawn to the field of human rights, you're somebody who is empathetic, right? So you're never going to listen to a story and not see value in it. And I think that there's this level of needing to be strategic that's really difficult. Like, has there ever been a case that came to you and you were like, I so badly want to represent this family, but they are not going to move the process forward in the way that we need it to? Like, how do you navigate that?
That is so well said. I can't wait to like go back and re-listen to this myself so I can write that down, because I feel like you've captured something so well that is a real challenge in this field and doing this. And it's like not just specific to this work. I think you kind of talking about it more broadly gives me a framework for thinking about these challenges. So I will say, when I first started, I was kind of trigger happy, which actually is a terrible language to use. Sorry about that.
All right. It's all right to be trigger happy. It happens.
But I just said yes.
You go right ahead.
Yes. Okay, I said yes to everything. I was, we got a referral, and that's how I ended up with these kind of 30-ish cases. Most of them were from the first year or so of people approaching me and saying, why not? Let's try it. This is all an experiment. But among those cases, I will say I had to triage and figure out which were the priorities, which ones I spend the most time on, which ones I submit first. I wasn't going to submit all of the cases at once. I was going to triage them, kind of stagger them, start with some of the strongest ones, maybe that had been featured already in the New York Times, that the Pentagon had already confirmed as civilian deaths, where there was no dispute that these people were harmed or that they were civilians, and leave others kind of on the back burner. So there are a few that are sitting on my plate that I haven't formally submitted yet, because I want to see progress on the ones I've submitted that, like you said, will move the process forward before I go to the others. But I still see them all as sort of part of the same, like you said, part of the same process of improving systems, even for the families where like I'm waiting to submit their cases a little longer, because I think that will be strengthened by other cases making progress. So it is a balancing act. And there's a part of me too that just because we're a very small team, it's me, and then I have colleagues in Iraq and Syria who translate for me and liaise with the families, and they get a lot of calls from them. I get WhatsApp messages from them checking in. And then our medical director, it's a really small team doing this. We can't do everything. And I think that's the hard thing too, is I haven't thankfully had to really say no to cases. I've said no to offers of like more evidence that could then lead to us contacting more families. Like I've had a journalist be like, oh, I have this whole trove of airstrikes. Are you interested? And I'm just like, at this point, I think expectations management is so key. Until we see progress on the cases I've taken on, I don't think it's responsible to take on a lot more. And I wouldn't encourage other NGOs to. It's different if a family proactively approaches an NGO and says, I want you to advocate for me. But if it's about just digging through archives from like airstrikes, I think it's not professionally responsible to try to connect with those families and offer them something.
I feel, of course, because I know you and I have affection for you, but I'm feeling really proud of you right now for being able to strike that balance, because I think that's something that Will and I can both speak to is the notion of compassion fatigue, right? Which is when you are working with families who have been so hurt by something. A lot of times, even when we know that we are not going to be able to get them to whatever they consider the end line to be. So like for Will and I, it was a lot of times, maybe we can't get them here to relocate to the United States. And maybe for you, Joanna, it's maybe we're not going to be able to get you the restitution that you're asking for. And sometimes we find ourselves in the position where the only thing that really we can offer is our ability to listen and to empathize. But when you're dealing with people who have been in these situations, their stories are really, really heavy. And so, I'm curious what your experience with compassion fatigue was, especially when you first started the work and how you've learned how to balance it better.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's something I'm still navigating, and where I think generally I've kind of figured out what I need to take care of myself so I can be present for the families I'm working with. In the beginning, I think, honestly, as someone, this is a topic that's been important to me since I was in middle school and the US invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. And I learned that civilian deaths were a thing, and it really haunted me and never stopped haunting me. And I think for me, part of the reason thank you. Well, part of the reason that I gravitated toward this work was being an American, like reading the news and feeling like if my country is bombing civilians, however I'd feel about a specific intervention, like I want to be doing something to respond to this and advocate for them. It'll make it a little easier to get up in the morning. And so it's really a privilege to be able to do this. And it's my own unburdening.
God bless you. It's a great thing.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, Will, like what your response would be, because I know that in talking to you sometimes, like you're military oriented, you've been in combat zones. I think that you have this very realistic understanding that war sometimes does engage civilians that weren't meant to be harmed. Like, how would you respond to someone like Joanna who comes to you and says like, hey, this is something that I'm moved by and this is something that I see? Like, what would your response be?
Come on in, please help me. I mean, that would be me. Please come on in, help me. I don't pretend to know war and all the things that can happen, this and that. But one of the things I always say that we should be blunt about what we talk about, because war as an idea deserves that. And so like, I would rather people, instead of saying civcas and like say dead innocent people. It's a hard thing for people to say.
It's really hard.
Let us speak. Let us speak of what's the truth. And if we can respect that truth, then we can start talking about some other things. But I hate euphemisms. And so when I talk about civilian casualties, it's personal for me because now, I'm on the other side and I see what happened in Afghanistan, right? And so those are some of the effects of what my country did. And so I don't allow people around me to get away with the euphemisms. It's like, well, we withdrew from Afghanistan and left a functioning country, blah, 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 or whatever. And I'm just like, well, why don't you go talk to some Afghan women and see what type of country you have? I don't know. That's kind of how I think about it. And I would welcome her, because if you want to be an effective military commander, and if you want to be successful in whatever your objective is, like, you need somebody to tell you stuff like this. The military is not very good at raising their officer corps to understand how NGOs work. And it's a huge problem inside the American officer corps that it's not until they're usually captains or maybe majors that they start understanding interagency, and they're really bad at it even then. That's my thoughts. Yeah.
But I think that's like one of the reasons why I was drawn to you in the beginning, Will, because like our political differences are stark, but I find you to be somebody who never lost his humanity. I find you to be somebody who is willing to acknowledge the scope of harm. And I find that for a lot of people in the military, that's something that they don't want to do, whether for their own personal sense of accountability, their own sense of survival. I think it's hard. So like, hearing about Joanna's work, are you advocating for, hey, let's bring the NGOs in sooner? Let's see what they have to say. Let's see how they could influence our work.
God, please. Oh, God. I don't know if you've noticed lately. I feel like I need to like throw all my stuff out of the way. I don't know if you've seen some of our results as of late. I would not call them confidence inspiring events. So I think I'm all in favor of bringing in the NGOs before we decide to do the operation and give them an actual seat at the table and not have to beg for it and like fight every time. Give them a seat and be like, this is what we're going to do. What are we doing wrong? This is what we want to do. Can you help us build the plan? You have to get them when you build the plan. You can't just give them, here, what do you think? And they're like, first, you're a horrible writer. And I can't understand a word you're saying on this piece of paper because you speak in this opaque acronym language. God, what happened to you? And it's just, I think that what Joanna does needs to be incorporated into operational planning, op planning. I am for civilians being all the way around the DoD because we outnumber them so many. We just have so many of us that to be really effective, they have to be in the brain trust, and that requires a little faith and put them on the table. I worked with civilians. I've worked with NGOs my entire career in Afghanistan. I was on provincial reconstruction teams. Good idea, bad idea, but I was very lucky to work with a lot of great NGOs in the field.
I have never heard a member of the military advocate for greater nonprofit intervention, but I love it because I think that it's a voice that is very rarely invited into the room, but deserves to be there, right? Like Joanna is well informed. She obviously comes, like you come from a specific standpoint, but you're well informed about the needs of the family and the ways that this can affect communities. And, like for example, Will, I think about how much you care about Afghanistan. So wouldn't it have been valuable to you to have somebody like Joanna there who's thinking about, a little bit more than just like, how does this affect the military action, but the community that you've come to really care about? I think, Joanna, my question for you is, you said at the beginning, like when you started this work, you just picked up the phone and called around until you found the right person. Like, what was their tone at first? Like, were they open to what you wanted to work with them on, or were they kind of like, get out of here?
That's funny. I was met with, I think because I approached it with kind of friendliness and curiosity, I was met with that too. I will say I've heard from others that like some folks had to convince their colleagues like, oh, actually don't, give her a chance, right? She's not, not going to tell you you're terrible. But there was this kind of openness. And now actually what you're talking about is actually happening to an extent with the Pentagon. There's this new civilian harm mitigation plan they're rolling out. They are mainstreaming this across the military. So it's not just one office that can be defunded. Like it's across the military, across the bureaucracy. They're hiring all these new people. And they've actually been inviting NGOs to speak to the new hires to be like, hi, this is what we do. We're not your enemies. Like, this is how to work with us. Here's what we can offer you.
Whoever did that for you, you have a good rabbi because that's the only way to get things done in the DoD. So God bless you. I'm so happy for you. You have to like, I never was able to solve that. God, they just screamed out in pain at the tactical level. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very different time now too. Like this is very new. It's a result of 2 decades of advocacy by civil society. All this news reporting, was really pivotal. Wow, I made up a word. Pivotal, and
that's what lawyers do, y'all.
New
Isn't
word,
that
everybody.
The truth?
Let's roll with it.
But it's really like pivotal. And frankly, like that's where the New York Times won a Pulitzer for a lot of the reporting that led to this plan. Yeah. It was saying the Pentagon has failed in all these ways to protect civilians in ways that were preventable, and they should have been learning from 2 decades of data they're sitting on. So now there's a center of excellence at the Pentagon where they're actually looking at this and they're trying to do better. And we'll see what happens. Of course, I don't want to get too excited prematurely, but the doors are open, and it's this really new civil society space where there's energy and it is forward-looking, thinking about what do future conflicts going to look like. How do we ensure that civilians are better protected and how war is fought, but then also what does the response look like? How can it better dignify people's losses, bring them to the table?
I think it's such an interesting lesson in accountability because when we think about the military, and Will, this might not go with what your experience was, but I think that to a lot of civilians, we have watched what has unfolded over the last 2 decades. and felt like, well, the military is going to do what the military is going to do. And I think it's an important lesson in sometimes the military is going to do things, but we as civilians still have a voice. And so if we can get the story in front of the right people, I think that we are at the point now after 2 decades of this particular conflict where the military is a little bit more oriented towards that humanitarian piece as well. Like, I think that we have seen the scope of harm, and we have, had people like these nonprofits and these reporters come in and say, are you considering like what the full scope of harm is? And so I think it's an important thing to flag for people that this notion of accountability, I think, is really gaining traction, especially when you have the Pentagon who's willing to implement its own sort of program for oversight. So this program, I think, Joanna, you said it's called the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan, right?
Yes. Wow. I'm so impressed. Although we lovingly call it the chim wrap.
You're going for those military acronyms.
That's why they like us.
You've been working with us.
Yeah.
God bless you. It's all right.
I love
that part of your brain will grow back. It's okay.
Well, I don't know, buddy. She's in it for the long haul.
Oh, God bless you.
Yeah, inshallah.
This program, I love you guys. You're so different, but you're not at all. But so this program's from 2022. And so a lot you had said when you emailed me about it is that a lot of ways it was a response to what happened in the war on terror. So talk to me a little bit about the development, and it's only really been implemented for less than 2 years. Like, what kind of growth and development have you seen? What kind of a direction are you hoping to take it in? And what kind of failures have you seen in these early days that we need to really address?
Okay. So first I'll say, I think the most positive thing I'm seeing is like, there is this new opening with civil society. There are these trainings now. They're hiring all these people. I think my sense is some of the teams I work with are still pretty small and hopefully will be staffed up. Like, it's like, just a couple people in the policy office doing civilian harm mitigation, the whole Pentagon. I'm like, they need like 10 times that number of people, CENTCOMs, just so it's a bigger team, but it's still maybe like, I think like 8 to 10 people. It's not huge, doing civilian harm work within, massive bureaucracy. And I really respect those people because I think a lot of them are former or current military and have seen, civilian, as you said, innocent civilians, being killed or injured, and that haunts them. And they feel like we could do better. And I want to be part of doing better, that this is, and I really respect that because it's painful to be on the other side and then, seeing these really tragic reports and, photos and other things, like it's re-traumatizing probably for them in a way.
It is
different for me, right? It's very personal.
100%.
So I really respect that a lot. But so that's one thing is the kind of just this hiring spree that's happening, the trainings and stuff. There's some policy changes. There were these interim regulations on condolence payments that were not great that came out, I think 3 or 4 years ago, that are being revised now, which I think, and really centering civilians' dignity, and saying that's why we should make these payments because it's important in itself. It's an end in itself. It's not a means to the end of counterinsurgency strategy. We need to do this because it's the right thing. So that's really powerful and important. I think the biggest challenge has been, so a lot of my cases are from Iraq, 2015 to 2017 in Mosul. There was this, Will's
like, I get it.
I'm gonna say
some heavy fighting.
That response is it all.
Some heavy fighting.
Heavy fighting, exactly.
That's
heavy fighting.
That's a real killing right over there. And what happened in Mosul for sure.
Exactly. And part of the reason that I have these cases that are some of them are a bit older is because it took years for those families to connect with a journalist at the New York Times who then reported on their story. This is Azmat Khan, who won a Pulitzer for her work. And then even longer for them to connect with a lawyer who could advocate for them. And they told her in the course of her reporting, hi, I want compensation. Of course, technically the military doesn't offer compensation, but that's the word we use.
Who told what?
What? Which part of it?
The compensation that the military
doesn't
does
offer compensation.
Oh no, not for there's a foreign
I used
claims
to do
act,
salacious
right?
payments all the time.
Like, oh yeah. Well, right. Oh, you did it. So you know how it works.
Yeah.
They just
all
pause?
the time.
Wait, can we pause for a second? Because people are not going to understand, Will, what you just said. What kind of a payment? What is that?
A salacious payment was like a payment that tactical level troops did in Afghanistan. I didn't see it as much done in Iraq, but I only had a year experience there. Where like, I don't know, let's say I call in an airstrike and it kills a family of 10 women, whatever. I don't know. It does damage. It kills. It can go anywhere from I killed your goats and that's going to be your sense of livelihood. And I've seen it kind of start to increase. And so that can be a form of it. It's like, here we have some money to offer you. So that is my experience. It's very, very tactical. Like you ran over somebody's kid with your car, which happened. Killed a kid. What do you do then? Like, what is your payment? What is that going to be? Because you have to do something here.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly that's what we're now. It's exactly the same thing we're fighting for these other families, right? And it's because there's not the intimate nature of the violence in the same way. I think that's why it's so much harder to actually connect the families to the military. I mean, I'd be curious. That could be another whole conversation, kind of what your experience was like. I'll go back to my thought. I'll finish the thought, but from before later. But what your experience was like with what kind of responses you would get when you were making those payments. How families responded. It's really a hard, painful thing.
It's a hard space to be in.
Yeah. Especially as someone in uniform. I feel like people are going to look at you just automatically as this is somebody who represents the harm.
Yes.
Like, were people receptive, Will, when you said to them, like, this is what I can offer, or were they
You
offended?
had to have the right intermediary.
Understood.
And you had to find the right person. And if you knew the lay of the land, which a lot of Americans didn't, let me just be very honest with you. Not bad soldiers or officers. They're just not a culturally oriented fighting force, and they never will be because they grew up in the United States, so they're not used to talking with other cultures, and so I think that's part of it. It's a heavy place to operate in, and that there's nothing that I can do that's going to take back anything or the pain that you're experiencing, and there's no way to really make that. I'm not right. I'm happy to go through the things. I did it on my own through probably ways I shouldn't have done it. Like you want a construction company contract here. We're going to redo your home and things.
Interesting.
And because I knew that the process wouldn't get anywhere, because I know so I could do I had a little bit of money. I could do hey, we should do a well repair or whatever here. That's what I tried to do at the very tactical level.
Yeah. And it's wonderful to hear about that, because it's exactly now what they're trying to kind of mainstream as best practice across all the combatant commands, and try to figure out what have we learned from these previous wars or wars that are still ongoing. How can we do better? What worked and what didn't? How can we do more? So I think those experiences are so valuable and important. That's exactly the work we're trying to do. And actually, so I brought up Mosul specifically because we got these cases. I've submitted all these requests for payments for exactly like that. And actually, I used a Salacia pay information sheet I got from one case, and it has the military's metadata on it. So I thought they'd feel more comfortable if I'm using their form.
That's
even
smart.
Though it's really not technically Salacia. Salacia is it's a very similar thing. It's just very bureaucratic. It's they call it ex gratia or something, but it's all the same Latin of compensation, but not, right? It's a payment, but it's not high enough amount to really be compensation. So I've been doing that for 2 years, and all of the requests for Mosul are still pending. And that's challenging, I think, because I see those cases as so key to leading to this CHMRAP, this new civilian harm mitigation plan, this New York Times reporting of these people's stories, which they told in painstaking detail to a reporter without expecting anything in return. That's what led to this new plan. And for me, it's painful to see this plan being rolled out, but these families not benefiting from it when it should benefit them too. They're the reason it exists.
Yeah.
And so I've been working with, folks at the Pentagon to try to encourage them, here are the reasons you should consider these cases now, despite some time passing. And I mean, to me, the most important thing is it's very much a present situation for these families. They're not getting back their loved ones who were killed, or, some of them have lost limbs. Some of them have kids with really severe brain trauma who can't, walk on their own, all sorts of things. And so those are, that's the reason it still matters to them. And therefore, since it's a finite number of people who, after all these years, still want this and are actually connected to the military, why not do the right thing?
Yeah.
They got $3 million.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, though, is that I'm hearing you say $3 million, and I understand that in some context, that's a really big amount of money. But when you consider the scope of civilian harm in a 2-decade war on terror, and how many of these families deserve to apply for this, I mean, a $3 million to me, that would be the amount that I would want for one civilian death, or for one injured child to tend to their needs for an extreme TBI for the rest of their lives. So my question, I guess it's another double question, and I'm sorry, this is just how I operate. But my
I love
question
it, I love
is,
it.
are the families that you work with hurt or offended when you tell them this is the amount that it's going to be? And as you engage in this work, are there any like very real efforts to say, hey, that $3 million, by the way, is not enough?
Excellent question. So first, absolutely. I would say the majority of the families I've talked to, like it takes a lot to wrap their mind around that amount of money, even though like I will say in Syria, especially a few hundred or thousand can go a long way. In Iraq, a bit less so. But oh yeah, it's like, are you kidding me? Like that's not compensation. I've lost my, and also especially when there's something material that was also harmed, like a house or a car, like people know the value of that. And I will say too, people know like in US courts what people get for like something where like there's a car accident, something else. And so they're like, also they know how much money the Pentagon has. And they're like, are you kidding me? It's like such a drop in the bucket. 3 million is nothing. And that's where the challenge is, like we're trying to get the Pentagon to do what it's authorized to do. And that is so hard when the scope is so much broader than that. And there have been attempts to more broadly address civilian harm. Like there's this Marla Ruzicka Fund for innocent victims of conflict that is actually named after the founder of the Center for Civilians in Conflict. It's a USAID fund that's a kind of non-monetary in-kind support for families that a lot of issues with. And it really hasn't been reaching intended recipients as much recently. There was some reporting on this a few years ago. So like even attempts to kind of address the scope of the problem more broadly, there's challenges around that. But to me, my job is twofold. One, like helping families understand what's possible and then working with them to try to at least get that and push the military on that, while also pushing for really a broader reframing of like, how much of a priority should this be for the Pentagon? They have a massive budget. They or other parts of the US government could easily have a much larger fund. Obviously, we should be preventing these deaths, right? But it could be a very, very different, number than that. Yeah. And I think for me, that's hopefully some of my life's work will be trying to figure out what do we need to push this country in that direction. I would much prefer we not kill civilians, that we not be, engage in wars, right? Who doesn't want that? But to the extent that that's happening regardless, like, how do we unburden the American public in a way from being like, okay, this is happening, but we can do better in response, right? And in fact, also, when there's a cost assigned to killing people, I think it maybe makes it, slightly harder to then continue to proceed in the same direction. I don't know how we get there.
I'm just thinking about like
talking honestly about it.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking though, like how people must feel, because you're right. When you're talking about something tangible, like, oh, oops, we blew up your house. Like that's one thing. We understand the cost of that. But when we're talking about the cost of a human life, I think that is one of the hardest parts of being an attorney, because everybody is going to try to value something differently. And at the end of the day, it's an innocent person who wasn't meant to be harmed by this. And so is there really an amount of money that we can give that is going to compensate for that, right? And it's a hard thing for us to have to do, to say, well, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that this is what that life was worth, but it's what we have that's available. So like knowing that right now the Pentagon's budget for this is extremely limited, and I have to say just again that 3 million is shocking to me. Good. Given what the DoD's budget is. I'm not surprised, but like I'm fucking offended.
Good. Well, you should be. Good for you. It should be offensive.
It's way too low. I love that response because it is way too low.
$3 million.
That exists.
I almost like my group at like the 480th. I mean, like I've been in organizations with like, it's just basically just run the credit card, bro. You just get the cool shit.
Yeah.
So there's more than that, and it's a shame that you're not getting more finances, because I've met very few. There's some, of course, of American soldiers and service members who are not like, I don't want to kill any civilians. Like, believe me, the majority of those who are pulling the trigger, whether it be up close and personal, from above, on a computer, whatever that is, they don't want that on their conscience.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. This is in everyone's interest, right? And that's
it's a mental health thing too.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That's going to haunt people. And that's something like I can't, I'm saying that intellectually, right? I'm like, this so viscerally that this is such a huge thing. And that's where I think bridging this gap is so important, because it's in everyone's interest to do better. Right. And, people who are kind of being put in these structures, like someone who's looking at a drone view screen, that was handed to them. They're not the ones creating the view screen or determining how they have to, they're the ones having to make these life or death decisions. But, we can do better than that.
I think that you made a critical point, though, which is that a lot of times we look at the military as this one uniform operator, right? And so if we see something that the military does that we don't like, we kind of put that on the individuals who are tasked with carrying certain things out. I have yet to speak to somebody who served and who is responsible for taking or harming a life that doesn't feel some degree of moral harm because of it. And I think that that is so, so important. We want people to understand that just because you're in the military doesn't mean you go into it guns blazing, thinking that this civilian harm is something that's acceptable or something that they have no attachment to, because I have found that it is actually something really different. As we talk a little bit, going back to that like budgetary question and military spending, which not a huge fan of, as I'm sure you guys can tell, are you trying to explore other options of validating the losses that these families have incurred, and like what would that look like?
It's a really good question. So there's a few things. Like there's the kind of what the NGOs can do to fill gaps, and then what the military can do that's not monetary. And and as you pointed out, like nothing is enough. And I've worked in other contexts with families who like have navigated the process for deaths in custody in the United States and immigration detention and policing, and who have gotten big settlements. Even then, it's really hard. It's very painful and fraught because it's still not enough. And like, there's also like accepting a large amount of money when your loved one is killed is another whole painful thing of like how people are going to see you. If you can, it's so complicated. But so in this case, so as an organization, we have piloted kind of very, very tiny responses for specific families and I have shared this with the Pentagon and plan to do so continuously through this year of like, here's what we were able to do, for a few $100s, we could replace the prosthetic leg of a man and enable him to walk again. We could give him a down payment for a small business that he could then start to support his family.
What a compelling way to do that, Joanna. That's brilliant. Way to make something intangible really accessible.
Yeah. And there's families like this one family in a remote part of Syria, we couldn't even send money, but we were able to hire someone locally to deliver food and medicine after the breadwinner died and the woman was in mourning and couldn't leave her house for months. So we've been able to do these small tangible things to show like the value of a small amount of money if they do make payments, right? Imagine what you could do. And then also be like, this is a model that could also be scaled up. The military does want to be piloting more in-kind, non-monetary responses, whether medical support or other things, as well as thinking about what a community response could look like, which itself ends up being very fraught when you end up dealing with like private development contractors working in these countries who are going to profit a lot from like working in a community. So that is a tough thing in itself. But I would say we're doing this. There are other groups that may be doing this. And actually one of my goals for the next year is to identify who all is actually piloting these kinds of responses while advocating for families, not even just in the context of US operations, but elsewhere. Where is it working? Where is it not? Like, what are we learning from this that we could do better? That's one big thing. And then in terms of the military itself, they have the capacity to scale up any of these kinds of responses, right? If it becomes a priority, or find implementers who can, if they don't want to be doing it directly. There's not an insignificant budget there.
Yeah.
So, oh man, nobody spends money like a bunch of small conservative
love their
conservatives,
toys.
Right? Hey, we're for small government. Boom! Biggest bureaucracy in the history of mankind. Good luck trying to navigate through it. Yeah. And then you start getting into the intelligence community. Yeah. Oh, and there's another door you have to get through, and everybody's compartmentalized all the information. I just applaud you because it takes a lot of dedication and determination to navigate those type of bureaucracies.
Yeah,
I couldn't do it. It's why I'm grumpy and why I'm retired, and why I never set foot in the Pentagon. As my mentor said, this isn't for you. Like this part, like the bureaucracy. We need you kind of out there. And okay, good. I like it out there.
Well, you know what I think, Will, is unique about you as a military member too, is that you are really oriented towards accountability.
Yes.
And I think like that's what's a hard part of Joanna's work, is that a lot of times these families want to hear, yes, we know that we hurt you and there was not we can't justify it, but you're not going to get that from something like the DOD, right? Like they're not going to come out with a mechanism for acknowledging the harm, because then they're kind of also saying, oops, we did something wrong. And so you kind of have to balance it in other ways that are still respectful of human dignity. And I think that that's hard, I want to sort of shift the conversation too, to talk a little bit less about like the mechanics of the work and more about the emotional human aspects of it. Because Joanna, you're coming into it, and I feel like a lot of these families are going to look at you as their contact point for this accountability, right? Despite the fact that you're not in the military and you had nothing to do with like whatever hurt or took something from them, you're now the face of the U.S. person who's representing their interests. So, what is it like to have to hear those stories, and how are you able to sort of bond with these families who have been so hurt by American interests?
Really good questions. And actually, I'm going to do something you may not like. It's going back to your last point really quickly. I do
totally
think something
fine.
I forgot to say that's important is the military does, they do acknowledge civilian harm and will sometimes apologize. I think, that's one of the other pieces I meant to mention before, is that it's important for them to do this more, whether it's issuing public apologies to kind of clear people's names, or, kind of dignify losses, or even when sending a private letter, like not having it be this bureaucratic language that I can't share with a family, making it something that it could share. Or even potentially in a high profile case, arranging a meeting with an official where they apologize. Like there's different tools they have that are potentially meaningful to different families. So that's one thing.
The reason I brought it up is because of Will. And Will, you are constantly talking about the fact that accountability from the government for what happened in Afghanistan is a necessary step to not just apologizing to our service members, but to really helping them heal. Like that acknowledgement is critical.
So I just think that, you have to first admit the fact you have to talk plainly about what happens in war. So that's why, like, even when we talk about like civilian casualties, I'm like, dead women and children. And then they died in agony and pain. And then it has caused a corrosive effect throughout the entire society. Because look, there is a part of me that can go like into a dark place and talk about war and combat, and that's a part of it. But the other part of it is also corrosive, and it kills things that it touches. And all the elixir and all the fun part of it, it also comes with this other part, right? And I think that the work that she does and the work that you do and your team does, I just think it's really important. And because nobody wants to like wake up to those horrors, and nobody wants to. And the more, the better we can do to keep innocent people from getting stuck between people trying to kill one another, the better. And I'll be honest, it'll never be perfect, but it's damn worth trying to do it, because that's what we owe it. We owe it our best, even if it's not great. $3 million is shit. Shit. I'm so sorry. Oh my God. 3 million. I mean, come on, DOD. Oh, I love you. God bless you. You're so cute. It's not even close.
It's a token.
It's just like, it's a rounding error. And look, the military, they get, you get in. Let me give you a perspective, and this is what you're going to get the pushback on. And I always hear it. It's like this, and it's true to a certain extent. Well, do you see the other side doing it at all when they kill innocent people? Right. So you get that. You're going to get that.
Yep.
And it's like, well, sometimes they do. How much have you been studying your adversary? Because actually you don't know, because they do it differently than you do. They can be effective without making a public announcement about it. That's the difference. They operate in different ways to have their restitution and accountability. If you're going to make it a bureaucratic way, which is, of course,
the American way.
Just fill the fucking form out. It's fine.
Wait,
I'm going to bring you to one of my Pentagon meetings.
Right? It's got to be easy, right? And it's hard. And I don't know. Sorry, I ramble on.
No, it's okay.
No, that's okay. Because our episodes are an hour, I do want to give some time to talking about like what that experience with working with the families is like.
Oh, for sure. Let's do that next. And actually, it brings me back to a point I think I had intended to make very early in the call when you asked me kind of what it's like doing the work, what motivates me. And I think for me, some of the most positive experiences I've had have been working with families. And I think especially kind of the initial calls I've had with so many of the families getting to know them a bit, and the level of gratitude I experienced was really moving. But then it also gives me the sense of responsibility. And the hard thing then is continuing to be in touch with them for weeks or months, keeping their expectations low around the timing, explaining how slow the military is. And you're exactly right that because I'm the focal point, I or my colleagues in Iraq or Syria are going to be the targets of anger as if we are the government sometimes.
Correct. Yep.
Like literally as if we're the government. And it's something that I think it took me some time to figure out how not to internalize. And once in a while, still it will it'll hurt because I'll feel like I wish I could do more. I'm so sad that I can't do more. And I kind of remind myself, this is the job you signed up to do. It's a privilege that you're the target of their anger because they're trusting you.
That's exactly it. Because you are able to operate in a difficult space, and God bless you for it, because it can make people weak. It's hard to operate in that space.
It's really hard.
It reminds me of like when I was tapped to do the mental health work when we were doing the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? And people came to me and they said, what group do you most want to represent? And I want my Afghan brothers and sisters who are listening to this to understand that I see your mental health needs and they are very, very valid. When I was in that role, I felt like I needed to offer, I think our quote was help the helpers first, because we really underestimate the emotional toll that this can take on the people who are in spaces like Joanna, because you are the face and you're the person who they're coming to. It's not just weeks or months, it's years. And like a lot of times families who have experienced like prolonged and painful trauma, like they don't have those boundaries in place to protect you. So it's really on you. And I am grateful and I admire the way that you've been able to do that, because it's the only way that you're able to persist in this work. And we need people like you in this work. So sometimes, I was accused of, why are you not closer with the families that you're working with? And my response was, this is as much as I can do to let them know that I care for them, but also to care for myself in a way that I can continue to do the work. Because otherwise, the helpers, the people like you, will drown.
No, I think
and they will drown you.
Yeah.
And not on purpose, right? It's just, that's what trauma is.
Yeah. And I think, it's so important, right? For anyone in the human rights space, the humanitarian space, we're going to all bring our own traumas and histories to the work, right? And I think a lot of people are in this space because they have their own history in some way with trauma or working, there's going to be something that motivates us to end up in this space. And because of that, we have to make sure that's not like affecting how we do the work. And also like our boundaries. And I think for me, it's really taken a significant amount of time to navigate what are my boundaries as someone who just works a lot too, right? And that this work is taxing. I loves it so much that it could become most of myself if I let it. To figure out what I need to be able to be present, especially if I'm about to have a call with a family who's lost a loved one. To me, like that kind of client care is the most important thing. And if I cannot be present for them, and no matter how they approach me, be absolutely like kind and generous with them, and while being clear, right? If I think what I'm being asked to do is unreasonable or like I shouldn't be doing the work, right? And I've also kind of checked in with myself about my own burnout. I do think I've experienced some of that in the last couple of years and kind of had to slow down, of course, and then kind of slow down enough, give myself time to then be able to kind of jump back in and not lose momentum, because we can't burn out in this space, right? There are, if you really care, like
who would do it? Yeah,
right. Exactly. Who would do it? People who really care need to be able to do the work. And so for me, like there's really some very basic self-care things I've learned. I need like fresh air. I work from home, a daily walk, especially if I've had a tough call, before I interact with any other people, right? If I have social plans that like before I do anything else, I need to do that. So I'm not then bringing that to other interactions. And then also like I've had terrible texting boundaries for a while because all my clients have my personal phone number. Yeah, I want to be available to them. Like I want to be available for an emergency. You got it, right? So figuring out like, okay, if I'm going to have people have my personal phone number, I don't have to reply over the weekend. And I could say, oh, hi, it was my weekend. Like, how are you doing? Right. I can figure out when is the emergency situation where I should, and where is it worth. I will say one thing I think I have done that has made the work so effective this year is going the extra mile to build relationships and listen to my clients and let them drive the case to an extent that I think maybe a larger nonprofit with like a lot of bureaucracy would not allow someone to do. And getting to know them in that way and maybe loosening my boundaries a bit, I think it's made the work more personal in a way I can bring that to my interactions with the military and my relationship building there, and also let my clients' interests and beliefs drive the work a bit more, like having more faith in them, like maybe even bringing them into a conversation potentially where a larger NGO might gatekeep and say, we don't trust them. Like I have a lot of faith in them and their ability to advocate for themselves too. And I think that's made a big difference.
I think you've made such a critical point though about the nature of your work, right? Because I think people look at lawyers and they think, okay, well, they work in court systems or procedural systems and it's very dry. But I think that probably you might underestimate, because you've been in the work for so long, that probably more of the healing that these families are able to participate in is because they have you as an advocate and not the amount of money that they're getting. But they now know that there is somebody in America who wants to hear their story and is going to take the time when they have the capacity to listen to what they felt and what they've been through. And so I actually imagine that like these years that you are fighting for them, you know, we might look at it and say, oh my God, like we haven't been able to get them the payout yet. And so we're not doing what we need to. But I actually think the advocacy piece is the healing piece. And I want to tie that into the work that Will and I do, which is, you know, our tagline for our company is let's talk about it. And the reason that that's our tagline is because we believe that there is always healing in conversation and in giving people a space to be able to talk about their stories. And I think, Joanna, before you started at the current place you're at, you had an internship at one point. Weren't you working with like female survivors of war at one point?
Yep.
And you talked to me
Good for you.
about,
God bless you.
you talked to me about support groups and the importance of conversation and the importance of community. So like in your work, when people come to you, this is my last question, but in your work, as people come to you and they're a little bit anxious about working potentially with an American maybe, or somebody who they feel like can't understand, how do you build that sense of community? And then Will, I'd ask you the same question as somebody who's going out in the community, but you're in uniform. So like how do you guys balance that need to give people a space to tell their stories and to make it so that they trust you to do that?
It's a wonderful question. I can't believe you remembered. That was 2016 in Sri Lanka.
I never
one
forgot
summer.
it.
I worked with this
I never
amazing...
forgot the way you talked about the women and the way that you held their pain so close. And I remember thinking, yeah, like this is a woman who will make a difference. I never forgot that story.
Wow, man.
Wow. Yeah.
That was
wow.
pretty. Man.
I mean, that's what motivates me too. I just in human rights work generally, knowing that the storytelling piece can be therapeutic and so important for people to be heard and have community, right? It's what makes it feel okay to do the work, knowing the outcome is uncertain. But I think with these specific families, there's a few families I've been privileged to get to know in person because they've been resettled here. Most have been all WhatsApp or phone calls or video calls. I think it's been helpful a few things. One, for the remote calls is just having a translator who's from the same country, speaks the same dialect, has some frame of reference for what they're doing has been so key. And my colleagues are so much more than translators. Like they end up liaising with these families. They're so compassionate. They fight so hard for them too in different ways. They help manage the medical support, other things we're doing. Like that's been really key. They're such key advocates for them too. And I think kind of just being very open and transparent about what I can and can't do, being kind and listening and trying to let them guide the conversation in terms of what these families want. With the families I've gotten to know in person, like I'm always blown away by the hospitality of people who have lost so much from so many parts of the world. Being invited into their home, dining with them, having your home cooking, not being allowed to offer anything as a thank you. I'm kind of participating in, their hospitality. In this case, they're Afghan refugees I was working with. So it's Afghan hospitality.
That does not surprise me. Afghan hospitality
so
is
delicious. So the kind of, being in community, I think in that very like fundamental human way is so key to then building trust. And I will say too, for me, like just like there's when there's a language barrier, like with my clients in person, I just would keep smiling at them. I will say that is a hit or miss with people who have gone through serious trauma. Like one of my clients would kind of readily smile back when I did, but his wife really couldn't. She's just so stoic from the losses she's experienced. So kind of it's a learning process. I feel like I have a lot more reading and learning to do about working with trauma survivors, processing trauma, all of that. Like it's learning on the fly. These kinds of conversations are so key to that.
Yeah. Can I just respond to that?
Yes, please.
I don't remember your original question. I'm sorry.
It was about
short-term memory issues.
Shocking.
I was just I was just listening intensely. I was like,
Bring
it. That's I just want to kind of, and then I'll let you close it out and tell everybody how stupid I can be. The trauma, like being a trauma survivor, I think that's what I kind of got from that. And I want to kind of pull on that thread a little bit, is that I don't care who you are, like, and what cause you're for. God bless you. You think they should win. You think they should win. You think this is the right thing, and how dare they do that. I've been there many times between warring factions, the Iraqis, the Kurds, this tribe, that tribe, blah, blah, blah. Whatever it is, the war that's going on, no matter what side you're on, it's a tragedy.
Yep.
That's what we can all agree on, that it's a tragedy that we still do this and probably always will because it's inherent in our condition. But that we can try to be better at it, because every time you pull that trigger, and I don't care if you kill somebody that you really want to kill, me, a part of you dies with that. And that part of you that dies with that is not just like, oh, that feels bad. It's, you realize that, wow, you can do that. Now you know that you are able to do that type of killing.
Yeah.
And all of that in war is a tragedy for the mother who doesn't have her husband to provide for them, to force child, marriages in Afghanistan. All of it is a tragedy, and what you do is so important. And I'm just like, I'm so happy you came on this show.
Cool.
I learned so much, and I'm
me
just
too.
grateful. Thank you for spending time with us.
I'm sad to have to wrap it up, actually. But Joanna, I just need to say that you're a gift. And you're a gift because you're not only setting in place processes that are going to help people generations from now to feel acknowledged by the scope of harm, but also because you give them a big piece of your heart, right? Like, you make space for people to come and make a home with you when they have felt like their home has been taken from them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just need to say thank you. And I'm in awe of you.
Yeah.
And so grateful for your work. And to everybody else who's been joining us on this podcast, thank you so much for sticking with us. We are so, so excited to keep putting out quality episodes like this one. So thank you for joining us and offering our guests a place to heal loudly. And we will see you guys next time.
Thank you all so much.